Welcome to the Fund the People podcast. I'm your host, Rusty Stahl. I'm president and CEO of Fund the People, where our mission is to maximize investment in America's nonprofit workforce. We give funders and nonprofits cutting-edge ideas, research, and tools to help drive equity, effectiveness, and endurance in the social sector. So let's start the show. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Fund the People podcast. I'm your host, Rusty Stahl. Thanks for being here. Welcome to season 9 of the show. Really excited for this season. We've got an amazing array of guests and conversations coming up. I think you're going to want to be here for all of it. So make sure you're following the show and looking out for us every Wednesday morning on your podcast feed. Next week, we're going to have our first interview of the season with Michael Thatcher, who is CEO of Charity Navigator. And that's going to be an important episode. We'll talk about the overhead myth and how overhead fits into their formula and how that can be changed, how nonprofits get rated and how overhead is a part of that or cannot be a part of that in the future. So you're going to want to listen to Fund the People podcast next week and all throughout this season. We've got a ton more incredible conversations and resources for you coming up. Now, I want to share some things about the season and some announcements. I've got 3 announcements for you. 1, our podcast is evolving. 2, I've got a new article out I want to talk to you about. And 3, we got some webinars coming up that I want to make sure you know about. So first, our podcast is evolving. Our episode format is changing slightly this season. We're making an effort to make episodes in this public feed that you're listening to more compact and tightly edited so you get to what you need faster. Second, we are adding video to this show. So a video version of these public episodes on our feed will be posted on all platforms that support video podcasts, including YouTube and others, Spotify, whatever we can get. And this will be rolled out gradually over the season as we sort out the technical aspects of adding video to a show. Third, we have launched a Patreon where we are hosting the premium version of this show. The premium version includes extended episodes with the full interviews and bonus content. It also includes conversations with me, both threaded conversations on the Patreon site, some live conversations. There'll be opportunities to talk with me, other members of the Fund the People team, and your fellow Patreon subscribers. We'll also have a Patreon-only podcast called Riverside Reflections, where I give you an inside view of Fund the People while we get out together for a walk by the Hudson River, here where I live in the Hudson Valley. And those episodes include audio, but also some video, so you get to see the surroundings and get a chance to watch me try to skip stones in the river. And we also sit silently for a brief meditation with the river's waves, lulling us into a kind of trance. So it's a great opportunity for me to talk with you directly and to reflect and get outside. And I hope you'll come with me as a member of our Patreon. So check it out. You just go to patreon.com/fundthepeople. That's patreon.com/fundthepeople. There's already a bunch of great stuff up there. You can view some things for free. Subscription is $6 a month and goes to support the national work of Fund the People, the organization which works to maximize investment in America's nonprofit workforce. And this podcast is part of our effort, so you'll be supporting our work and our advocacy and influence efforts to strengthen and support the nonprofit workforce. So I hope you'll join us there, patreon.com/fundthepeople. Second announcement, I've got a new article out in the Nonprofit Quarterly. The article is called SOS, Nonprofits Need Funding for Staff Operating Support. Shockingly, this article is actually on the homepage of the Nonprofit Quarterly website. So at least as of this recording, on Monday, January 19th, you can go to nonprofitquarterly.org to read the article. I'd appreciate it if you take a look, share it with your colleagues, email me if you've got any feedback, and I may write more if I have the opportunity to do so in the quarterly. So email me if you have ideas for articles. My email address is rusty@fundthepeople.org. I look forward to hearing from you. Do not hesitate to write with your thoughts. The third announcement is that we have a webinar coming up, and actually a whole webinar series. The first one is going to be on February 12th from 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern, and that's going to feature friend of the show, Alicia Smith Arrilaga, the Vice President of Research at the Center for Effective Philanthropy, and Alicia is going to walk us through their new research on the state of nonprofits, burnout, money, etc., and what funders need to know about what's happening in the nonprofit community. And there's really some important data in here about the disconnect between how funders see what's happening, how nonprofits see what's happening, what they all think should happen. So please join us February 12th, 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern, 10 to 11 a.m. Pacific. We will be getting this webinar info up on our website soon. But for now, if you want more information, be sure to join our mailing list. Go to fundthepeople.org/#connect to join our mailing list. That's fundthepeople.org/#connect. And we'll share more information on future episodes of the podcast as well. We've got more webinars that are going to come up in March, April, and May. So stay tuned and make sure you join our mailing list to get that information. Now, today on the show, I want to speak with you about the Martin Luther King holiday this week and how activists are being branded as terrorists, and some folks who are using terror and violence are being rebranded as activists. As we go into this year, there's some conversation in the field about how do we create a positive narrative about the nonprofit sector to counter the negative narrative that's been blasted out through the bully pulpit of the White House and their friends in Congress and in the administration. And as we try to undo some of that damage of just the narrative about us, I want to encourage the nonprofit sector and all of us not to accept the premise of the Trump administration's war on charity, of the Trump administration's assaults on the nonprofit sector and civil society. Rather than argue that, no, they're wrong, nonprofits are actually good, look at all the good stuff we do, we should point out the bad stuff that the administration is doing to the nonprofit sector, to Americans, to America, by trying to defame, defund, and destroy this pillar of our constitutional freedoms and liberty, of our community, our economy, and our democracy, the nonprofit sector. We should be pushing back and showing their attacks for what they are, lies and propaganda that are meant to make a new fake enemy out of the nonprofit sector, like they made a fake enemy out of the news media and other institutions and sectors in our society. This week we have off on Monday in recognition of the birthday of Dr. Martin Luther King. This was a hard-won federal holiday honoring one of the major social justice figures of modern American history. Dr. King peacefully pushed our country to end legally imposed racial segregation that had its roots all the way back in the 1600s, the beginning of slavery. And like others before him and since him, Dr. King was met with violence and deadly force. You might even call his murder terrorism, because it was meant to strike fear and silence into the civil rights movement. And so that is one example historically where activism has been turned into terrorism. They tried to label Dr. King an agitator, and yet he was met with terrorism in response to his peaceful protest and assembly. Flash forward a bit to something slightly less historic and dramatic. In 2023, Michael Smith was our esteemed guest here on the Fund the People podcast. And Mr. Smith was the appointed CEO of AmeriCorps under President Joe Biden. We reached out to Mr. Smith to discuss how he was trying to improve the wages and benefits awarded to AmeriCorps members, those young people and seniors who are out there serving Americans through being placed in nonprofits and schools through the AmeriCorps agency. But for Michael, the hook to coming on the show was talking about how AmeriCorps had this incredible and unique role as the federal government's hub for the Martin Luther King holiday, as well as the 9/11 holiday. And he talked on the episode about how AmeriCorps, the agency, would reach out to hundreds of nonprofits, help them get resources, share opportunities that nonprofits were providing for people to serve, and how they carried this idea of MLK Day as a day on, not a day off, as a chance to spark service, volunteerism, and activism, not just one day, but year-round and for a lifetime. Now, this administration last year, in 2025, did its damnedest to destroy AmeriCorps, leaving it as a shell of its former self with no staff and no AmeriCorps members out there. And in the process of doing that, they downgraded recognition of the Martin Luther King holiday. I'm pretty sure there's no more hub coordinating service opportunities and messaging for the King holiday in the federal government now. In fact, if you go to the link from the show notes of that episode with Michael Smith, which previously held shared resources for the King holiday, it's now a 404 error. The page cannot be found. And the whole AmeriCorps website is basically down. It just says it's under construction. In the show notes for this episode, I'll put a link to the Michael Smith episode, which is worth a listen to hear from Michael about how he thought about AmeriCorps and its role in working with nonprofits and with the federal government on the King holiday. Now, another thing that I learned about in looking at what the Trump administration is doing for the King holiday this year, a quick Google search led me to find that another way they've downgraded the holiday. Apparently, our national parks used to be free for this federal holiday and other holidays for American citizens. And this year, they've decided no longer to offer free entry to national parks for Martin Luther King Day or for Juneteenth. All the other federal holidays are still free to go into these national parks. So there you have it, a minor but significant slight to the African-American community and to our history and the history of civil rights and freedom in our country. Of course, what's going on in our country right now, aside from the King holiday, is this administration has been using lies and propaganda in an attempt to frame anti-ICE protesters and progressive activists and philanthropic funders and nonprofits as terrorists or terror-supporting organizations. A new term that this administration invented, terror-supporting organizations, because we didn't used to have any term for domestic terrorists. The law only allows them to declare organizations from outside the United States as terror organizations. So they made up a new category, terror-supporting organizations, that they could use domestically to try to label nonprofits and social movements as terror-supporting organizations. Now, we know that Martin Luther King and his many colleagues and collaborators worked within a nonprofit context. They had the Southern Christian Leadership Council, SCLC. They had the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, and thousands of churches, civic organizations, labor unions, and other institutions built and supported a mass movement that led this country peacefully to end segregation. And again, those organizations, those people were accused of being agitators, troublemakers. They were spat upon, they were bullied, they were beaten, and in some cases, they were murdered. They were bombed, shot, etc. So on this day, this week, this moment of remembrance and celebration of Dr. King, let's remember him as a peaceful freedom fighter who helped to free us all. And let's continue to protect the First Amendment freedoms that enabled him and his movement colleagues and that enable us today to assemble, to speak truth to power, to organize and fund nonprofit organizations, private organizations, and social movements for change. And let's be very clear about who is using fear, violence, and intimidation to terrorize activists and protesters. Activism is one thing. The doctrine or practice of vigorous action or involvement as a means of achieving political or other goals, sometimes by demonstrations or protests, etc. Terrorism is a whole different thing. The unlawful use of violence or threats to intimidate or coerce a civilian population or government with the goal of furthering political, social, or ideological objectives. These are very different activities. And they keep getting confused in our public discourse. So when the right-wing torch-bearing march happened in Charlottesville and the protesters against that were attacked, and when Heather Heyer was killed by a vehicle that slammed into the crowd of counter-protesters, the president said there were good people on both sides. He diminished the murder. He diminished the hate coming from the torch-bearing, chanting, blood and soil right-wing demonstrators. When January 6th happened and that mob broke in to the U.S. Capitol after fighting and bear spraying police and tried to break in to the chamber of the House of Representatives, and one law enforcement officer shot one activist who was just about to get into that chamber, she was made into a hero, an activist, not a terrorist. And those protesters, those rioters, that violent mob was first let go. Then the government found them over time and put them on trial. And those who were guilty of breaking the law were found so in the courts. And then they were all pardoned by the president. When Kyle Rittenhouse shot and killed several left-wing protesters during the racial uprising several years ago, he was turned into a right-wing hero. When Melissa Hortman and her husband were killed, who were Democrats, and she was the leader of the Minnesota legislature, when they were killed, we barely heard a whisper about it from the White House. When Charlie Kirk was killed, the right-wing Trump-supporting activist, when he was assassinated in a horrible shooting, he was made into a saint, a demigod. And they used that opportunity to say they were going to attack, investigate, destroy social justice movements and funders. And in particular, they targeted Open Society Foundation and the Ford Foundation. When Renee Good was murdered by an ICE officer not too long ago, the administration, instead of investigating the ICE officer and having an objective, impartial, fact-based investigation into what happened, they declared Renee Good and her wife, who watched her be murdered, to be terrorists. So you could pick up on a pattern here, and these are just some of the high-profile examples, where they've minimized the terrorism of violence of people on quote-unquote their side and maximized the rhetoric against people who didn't seem to be violent but were on the opposite side. Again, taking activists or peaceful protesters and turning them through rhetoric into terrorists, and taking people who terrorized others and were violent and turning them into activists. They keep this drumbeat going. They keep doing this over and over. And it's not just with these individual cases. It's also the way they've tried to reshape the law. So you may be sick of me talking about it, but their bill, H.R. 9495, the nonprofit killer bill, which was the first legislation they introduced in Congress after the 2024 presidential election, failed then. They put it back into H.R. 1, which President Trump called the big, beautiful bill. It was in there again. And that legislation, what they were trying to do was make it so that the Secretary of Treasury could declare any 501c3 a terror-supporting organization without any proof without offering evidence, and without decent due process. And by declaring them a terror-supporting organization, they could, as a government, wipe them out of existence. Now, they haven't gotten that law passed, but they're trying to do it informally with their propaganda, with their pressure tactics, and by reshaping the public narrative about activists and protesters as terrorists. So we've got to be mindful about this. We've got to watch this. And you know what? A lot of the advice last year was about individual nonprofits hunkering down, hardening their shell, preparing themselves in case they were targeted for attacks. Well, we can't just do this one nonprofit at a time because they are trying to change the entire system. And any attack on one foundation or one nonprofit is really an attempt to silence all of us, to weaken all of us. It's a probing for weakness, and it diminishes our ability to act and speak and believe. So we don't need more rugged nonprofit individualism. We need to act together in solidarity with one another. I want to end my comments today by quoting from a column in the New York Times this weekend by M. Gesson. It's just a really powerful piece that is resonating with me, and I want to share with you. I've edited it down a smidge. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but they write, quote, "We are still a country with a robust civil society. We still have independent media. We still have elections. We can't count on the freedoms and resources we enjoy today to still be available to us tomorrow. Ask anyone who has lived in a country that became an autocracy, and they will tell you some version of a story about walls closing in on them, about space getting smaller and smaller. The space they are talking about is freedom. In Russia, mass protest used to be possible. Then mass protest became impossible, and the only option was what we called the one-person picket, a person standing alone with a sign. Then people started getting arrested for standing alone with a blank piece of paper, for liking something on social media. Russian journalists used to know they could write freely as long as they stuck to culture and avoided politics. Now a person can get arrested for performing a tune by a band songwriter. Of course, the column goes on, the United States is not Russia or Hungary or Venezuela or Israel or any of the other democracies that have turned or are turning themselves into autocracies. But now is the time to focus on the similarities and try to learn from the ways other countries have cracked down on protest, eviscerated their electoral systems, limited their media freedom, and built concentration camps. The only way to keep the space from imploding is to fill it, to prop up the walls, to claim all the room there is for speaking, writing, publishing, protesting, voting. It's what the people of Minnesota appear to be doing, and it's something each of us needs to do right now while we still can." End quote. That is just so powerful. I'll just say this line again. The only way to keep the space from imploding is to fill it, to prop up the walls, to claim all the room there still is for speaking, writing, publishing, protesting, voting. And it's worth noting, folks, that we did have the government break into a journalist's home and raid it and take away tech like laptops or phones to try to find the source of some article that was like a leak about something the government did. That is not normal in our country. So there's a lot of space that is collapsing or getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And we need to be aware of it, and we need to prop up these walls. So if you are a peaceful protester or a peaceful activist and you get called a terrorist or an agitator, something like that, maybe you're doing something right. Because strong men who are weak are terrified of the moral power of peaceful activists and protesters, which means we need to keep speaking out. We've got to use our First Amendment rights to keep our First Amendment rights. And while we do it, we've got to keep our own tanks full, take care of ourselves, and take care of one another. I will talk to you again soon. Thanks for being here. Keep listening to your Fund the People podcast. Thanks for listening to Fund the People podcast. Visit fundthepeople.org and click on podcast to find a transcript for this and other episodes and all the links discussed in the episode. If you enjoyed this episode, we'd really appreciate a 5-star rating and a quick review if possible on Apple Podcasts. It helps more people to find the show. Thank you for driving change in our communities. Remember to keep your tank full, take care of yourself, and take care of one another.